For the month of July, we will be focusing on the environment. I don't know if everyone knows this, but our denomination, the United Church of Christ, or the UCC, has been involved in the environmental movement since its earliest days. We have been heavily involved in anti-racism efforts as well, and we were a driving force behind establishing a link between racism and environmental pollution. These two concerns, racism and environmentalism, started out as separate efforts and separate movements, as separate streams in general. But then these two efforts that were running side by side came together within the UCC. And that's the story that I want to focus on today. The story of how these two streams came together to become a river, a mission area that's now referred to as environmental racism, or more generally, environmental justice. When the United Church of Christ was formed in 1959, racism was high on our list of concerns right from the start, while our attention to environmentalism came soon after. Our involvement in both anti-racism and in environmentalism was as frontline leaders. We were on the front lines. We were marching with Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., and we were involved early as society first began to come to grips with the problems being caused by pollution in the environment around us. If you were alive back then, you may remember that back in the early 1960s, when Americans in those days were consuming large amounts of gasoline containing lead, driving cars with inefficient engines with really low gas mileage, industry in general was releasing massive amounts of smoke, sludge, and chemical byproducts with little concern about bad press or government regulations or anything like that. Air pollution was commonly accepted as the smell of prosperity, a sign of progress, not something we should discourage, certainly not something we should regulate. That all started to change around the same time the civil rights movement was gaining steam, when an environmentalist book called Silent Spring was published in 1962 by Rachel Carlson. This book created a cultural awakening and caught our attention as a new denomination. The book raised awareness about the impact of pollution for all living organisms and showed that there was a clear link between pollution and public health. We as a church saw environmentalism as a cause that everyone could get behind. During that time, the civil rights movement was dividing the country, left versus right, black versus white, north versus south, as the country grappled with racism both in policy and practice. And so there was the thought that maybe caring for the environment could be a uniting factor in our divided country. After all, air pollution and water pollution impact everyone. The poor, the young, the old, all races, all animals, all plants, everyone. At least that was the initial thinking, our initial hope. Later on, we would uncover a strong link between racism and pollution, but I'll get to that shortly. As we approached the 1970s with the Vietnam War, the murder of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., riots, the Cold War, there was plenty of division. Yet there was this optimism we could find unity as a country under the banner of environmentalism. In 1970, after much effort and far more division than we anticipated, the Clean Air Act was passed. Pollution standards started to take hold, some more effective than others. We mostly cured the problem of acid rain by instituting a program of cap and trade on sulfur emissions. You remember the ozone hole? We successfully addressed that as well. And the UCC was a leader in each of these efforts. We were organizers in the 1970s, sponsoring events, preaching on the environment frequently, and being a peaceful presence, a prayerful presence at most environmental demonstrations. Yet that movement was primarily led by young white people, which means that black voices, Hispanic voices, were not fully at the table, creating some big blind spots in our efforts. At the same time, in the late 1960s, the UCC was actively involved in the civil rights movement. And one of our churches had become a flashpoint due to racism in Wilmington, North Carolina. And soon North Carolina would become very important to both streams of our story. Both the anti-racism and the environmentalism would come together there in North Carolina. The anti-racism leg of this story involved a high school where a number of black students were protesting their treatment during a half-hearted attempt at desegregation in the Wilmington school system. The 9 or so students who led that effort were members of a UCC church, and that church encouraged and supported their anti-racism efforts. But they found they needed more help. They weren't making much progress. So their pastor contacted UCC leadership in Cleveland, and in 1971, the UCC sent a young Benjamin Chavis Jr. from the UCC's Commission for Racial Justice to work with this group of black high school students and UCC youth. Yes, the UCC literally employed black activists during the civil rights movement, and we actually still do so to this day. Chavis, one of these young activists, then aged 24, came to that UCC church to provide leadership to these high school students. Because of his tremendous gifts, this UCC church, mostly a black church with a white pastor, became the center of anti-racism efforts in Wilmington. Ben Chavis, who had worked directly with Martin Luther King Jr., was incredibly effective, listening to and prioritizing the students' issues and helping them develop effective countermeasures. And not surprisingly, this enraged the local white establishment and white supremacy groups in the area. Soon, that little UCC church became a church under siege. The life of the pastor was threatened. A grocery store a few hundred feet from the church was burned to the ground. A black youth was shot to death by police across the street from the church, and then a white policeman was shot dead, all within a block of our church. Several hundred Klansmen were in town and were believed to be behind much of the violence. The National Guard moved in and surrounded our church, and the situation was slowly brought under control. But the problems at the high school and the situation that was called into focus by that UCC church activism served as a wake-up call to the local black community. The UCC decided to keep Ben working there to support anti-racism efforts in the wider community as Ben began his efforts to become ordained within the United Church of Christ. Chavis was very effective when he'd learned from Martin Luther King Jr., and he led efforts to reduce the systemic racism. And things were looking up for the black community in Wilmington, or so it seemed. In reality, behind the scenes, evidence was being fabricated by local police, and 3 witnesses were lined up to testify against Chavis and his inner circle of student activists. In March of 1972, Ben Chavis and 8 young black men still in high school or recent graduates were arrested by police in the doorway of the Wilmington UCC church, along with a white social worker who had also supported them. This group of 10 people would become known as the Wilmington 10, and all were found guilty in a sham trial, and each were sentenced to 28 years in prison. The 10 were immediately detained. 3 months later, with the group fearful for their lives after an attack by white inmates, the United Church of Christ in Cleveland posted bail for the entire group during the appeal process. No one else would do it. We did it. We got our people out of jail. But we lost the appeal. No court in North Carolina would hear us. Individual churches within the UCC denomination were torn over this case. Most white churches in North Carolina found it impossible to believe that the police would frame these young men. They must be guilty. But UCC leadership knew with no doubt that these people were innocent and the victims of a racist white supremacist system designed to wipe out any sort of anti-racist activism. The fabrication of charges against black leaders was part of that system. This had been done over and over again. jailing and falsely convicting black men to silence them, to get them out of the way, was a common practice. And now that practice had ensnared our church, our denomination, that in 1972 was only like 15 years old, was called to publicly invest its name, its faith, and its resources into the struggle for freedom for our staff member, young Ben Chavis, and the 9 others as well. Freedom for these 10 became a rallying point for the UCC and an international cause. The UCC continued to advocate for these folks as much as we were able. We paid for and supported Ben Chavis as he attended seminary while incarcerated, a special arrangement orchestrated by the UCC. 6 years later, in 1978, Amnesty International declared the Wilmington 10 as political prisoners. Yet it was until 1980, after 8 years in prison, after all the witnesses had publicly recanted their stories, that a circuit court in North Carolina overturned their convictions and they were finally released. Soon after Ben Chavis Jr. was released, he was ordained by the UCC and was given a high-level job, a leadership position by our denomination to work on efforts to fight against white supremacy. It was this newly ordained Ben Chavis who would soon be drawn into environmental justice. This is where these two streams regarding justice, the stream of racial justice and the stream of environmental justice, began to merge. At the same place, at the same time, with the same man. While Ben was in prison, also in North Carolina in the late 1970s, a group of residents began to protest the creation of a landfill for the disposal of highly toxic PCB, which were banned by Congress. A private company, the Ward PCB Transformer Company, trying to avoid EPA rules, intentionally dumped about 32,000 gallons of PCB-contaminated oil along 240 miles of highway shoulders in 14 counties in North Carolina to avoid the new pollution regulations. Once discovered, the contaminated soil along the highway had to be cleaned up and put somewhere. No one wants that in their backyard, though. Who wants a toxic waste site in their own area? So when locations get chosen, they're usually poor areas that are selected. Poor areas where people have little or no political power, where land is cheap and easy to come by, in short, where the people impacted are not in a position to fight back. But in this case, it wasn't the poorest county that was selected, it was the county with the most black people. And this is where another little-known or unknown hero, another UCC member named Dollie Burwood comes in. When it was announced that her county was going to be the dump site for those 32,000 cubic tons of PCB-contaminated soil, this 32-year-old black woman, a UCC member, as I mentioned, stood up and said, "No, this is not right." Dollie Burwood was the mother of 2 young daughters at the time and a veteran of the civil rights movement. She organized local residents and churches and civil rights leaders, including the leadership of her UCC church, to march to the dump site and to sit in the road in a nonviolent protest. She was arrested, and the next day she contacted Reverend Ben Chavis Jr., who had been recently released from prison, to see if maybe he would come back to North Carolina, if he would consider helping out again. Just right after he got out of prison, the year's 1980, right after he'd spent 8 years on false charges in jail, Chavis came and was able to confirm what Dollie Burwood suspected, that the dump site location had been determined based on the race of the residents of that county. Under their leadership, protests grew and lasted about 6 weeks, with over 500 people arrested in the process. And that's when the term environmental racism, a term that had never been used before, was first coined by Reverend Chavis. When the first 10,000 planned truckloads of PCBs arrived in September of 1982, hundreds of protesters laid down on the highway to prevent the trucks from entering the site. It was the largest civil disobedience in the South since Reverend Dr. King had marched through Alabama. And it was the first time in American history that citizens were jailed for trying to stop toxic dumping. The site was ultimately closed. The national reporting of this story led other people from across the country to contact Reverend Chavis with many other examples of environmental racism. Under Reverend Chavis' leadership, the UCC Commission for Racial Justice issued the landmark report in 1987 called Toxic Wastes and Race in the United States. The study showed that race was one of the biggest factors associated with the location of toxic waste facilities nationwide, that 3 out of 5 Black and Hispanic Americans lived in communities that housed what the EPA at that time called uncontrolled toxic waste sites. As Reverend Chavis would say, the issue of environmental racism is an issue of life and death. It's not just an issue of some form of prejudice. This can kill you. This is an issue that will cost you your life if you don't get involved. Since then, United Church of Christ has continued its environmental justice work. And environmental justice has become a core part of our denomination's character. The UCC's environmental justice movement has been involved in uncovering dozens of situations where pollution or pipelines were located someplace based on the race of the residents, with Blacks and Hispanics being exposed to far more pollution than others. The United Church of Christ is committed to giving voice to the powerless, to upending structures of power that distribute pollution to certain groups while protecting others. Our UCC ministry in the area of environmental justice is due to Dollie Burwood and to Reverend Chavis, who championed both anti-racism and protection from environmental hazards, and whose activism continues to this day, as they're now both, I think, about 78, both Dollie and Ben. All this pollution, all this garbage we dump in the air, land, and water ends up in our bodies, in all life, our children. This is, as Reverend Chavis put it, a matter of life and death. In affirming the divine gifts of creation, in affirming our connection to God, each other, and the world around us, we committed ourselves and we commit ourselves to the intertwined responsibilities of caring for creation and seeking justice for the oppressed. Because God has called us to this action, and we have responded to that call. In Jesus Christ.